So, in one of my last videos, talking about my ideas for the future of fantasy television, I said that I thought the Stormlight Archive by Brandon Sanderson would be the perfect series to adapt for TV, even going so far as to say that it could be the next Game of Thrones in terms of cultural impact. While many commenters on that video seemed to agree with my stance, there were also those who raised concerns. One that caught my attention in particular was the idea that the Stormlight Archive would be too expensive for television, which got me thinking. We live in an age of colossal budgets for fantasy projects, but still, the Stormlight Archive would pose unique challenges. The world of Roshar, where the series is set, is extremely distinctive and unlike our own, in some ways more closely resembling an alien planet like Pandora from Avatar. Adapting it for the screen would certainly pose some unique production challenges, and I wanted to make a video breaking those down and exploring some ideas for how you could overcome them in a hypothetical Stormlight adaptation, using knowledge drawn from my bachelor's in film.
This is worthless.
It's less than worthless, my boy.
Now, one suggestion I saw a lot in the comments of that last video was doing the whole series in animation. I think that this would definitely be the most straightforward route you could go, as it would bypass many of the hurdles of physical production. We've certainly seen animation used to depict worlds as singular as Roshar, and animation could be uniquely suited to depicting some of these series' more intense, magically charged action sequences. In fact, there are a wealth of Stormlight animations already on YouTube that prove this exact point, which I will link in the description below. So what's the issue then? Problem solved. Well, while I am a huge fan and proponent of animation, I don't think that an animated series would necessarily have the same cultural impact as a live-action one. Now, I'm not going to go on some tirade denouncing animation as a lesser medium. Some of the best shows of this type that we've gotten in recent years have been animated. Still, my expertise lies more on the live-action side of things, and while I don't think a live-action adaptation of the Stormlight Archive would be easy, or cheap necessarily, I think it would be doable. For this video, I'm going to be focusing on the first book in the series, The Way of Kings, and how to adapt that. Let's imagine, for this hypothetical, that there's a shadowy cabal of executives watching over us, and if we can nail the first season of the show, they'll give us an infinite budget for subsequent seasons. So, what makes The Way of Kings so well suited to be adapted into a season of live-action TV? We'll start with what I think is one of the biggest points in its favor: locations and sets. In many live-action fantasy adaptations, locations and sets are a huge budgetary consideration, with massive expenditures going towards transportation and set construction. While sitcoms and other shows can often get by with just a handful of pre-built sets, fantasy works often jump sporadically between extravagant locations, with characters traveling far and wide on their epic quests. You need only watch the intro to Game of Thrones to see how many fantasy locations they needed to fully realize per episode. Now, this is one huge thing that The Way of Kings has going in its favor, because 90% of the first book takes place in 3 locations: Hearthstone, Kharbranth, and the Shattered Plains. Starting with the easiest to shoot, Hearthstone is a village that one of the main characters, Kaladin, hails from, which we see repeatedly in flashbacks throughout the story. It is a rural farming village, and yeah, that's pretty much all there is to it. I think you could easily throw up a few buildings on a lot somewhere, or maybe if you're lucky, just repurpose some old set from like The Witcher or Game of Thrones. I feel like these sorts of rural medieval towns make up the backbone of most fantasy television. The 2 notable interior sets you would need would be Laurel's house, Kaladin's father, with its surgery room and kitchen, and the Light Eyes Manor, although that's only needed for one scene and you could probably just film it in the producer's mansion or whatever. Moving on to Kharbranth, where another one of the main characters, Shallan, is located in the first book. I think you could easily take the Game of Thrones approach of shooting the exteriors somewhere in the Mediterranean to capture the look that Brandon Sanderson was going for. One Reddit user pointed out the similarity between art of Kharbranth and Positano, Italy. A list of the interior sets you would need would include the Conclave, the Palaneum, Jasna's alcove, Jasna and Shallan's rooms, the dining chamber, the gardens, the hospital, etc. But let's move on to the biggest location consideration, the Shattered Plains, where most of the action in the book takes place. The Shattered Plains has unique topography, unlike anywhere in the real world. Aerial shots of the region would need to be done using visual effects, or, if you were really going for gold, you could use model work instead. Most of the scenes that take place directly on the Shattered Plains revolve around bridge runs, where main character Kaladin and his bridge crew are forced to run a heavy bridge into archery fire from their opponents, placing their bridge over large chasms so that the main Alethi army can cross over them and jump from plateau to plateau. You would most likely need to construct sets featuring these chasms, although the sets themselves wouldn't need to be large, and if you were creative, you could probably find ways of rearranging segments of them to create new configurations. Now, you could build these sets on a lot with green screens in the background, or, God forbid, on the volume. However, the coolest thing would be to actually go to southern Utah, the area that Brandon Sanderson has said inspired the Stormlight archive, and build the sets there, out in the open, using the natural scenery and environmental conditions to add to the realism. You could even possibly use the slot canyons in Utah to film scenes in which Kaladin and his bridge crew are down in the chasms between plateaus, although, for safety reasons, these might need to be sets as well. The other important section of the Shattered Plains is the Alethi war camps, located on the outskirts. For the exterior scenes, you could honestly probably just build one war camp set and dress it to make it look all nasty and grimy for the scenes set in Sadius' war camp, then clean it up and make it orderly for the scenes set in Dalinar's camp. Besides Hearthstone, Kharbranth, and the Shattered Plains, there are a few other locations visited, most notably in the book's many interludes, but most of those are pretty minor and non-specific. You know, a field, a garden, a hallway, and you could shoot them pretty much wherever, maybe at the producer's mansion. But of course, when it comes to realizing the world of Roshar, locations are only half the battle. There is also the unique flora and fauna of Roshar, including its many species of large crustaceans like chulls and chasm fiends, and its stimuli-reactive plants. Now, these could obviously be realized using CGI, although I would of course advocate for using practical effects first. I mean, just imagine a giant practical chull lumbering around. I would just want to give it a big hug. There are the Parshendi, the Alethi's opposing force, with their marbled red and black skin and organic armor plates. You need only look at makeup and prosthetic creations like the White Walkers from Game of Thrones or the Clickers from The Last of Us to see what can be achieved in this arena. If done right using makeup, these would be just the coolest looking dudes. As far as costumes and props, seeing shard blades and shard plate in live action, as well as the sphere currency they use in the series, would be just an absolute delight. More challenging perhaps would be the Spren, mostly small, form-changing spirits that emerge in association with different natural occurrences and human behaviors. What makes them a challenge is their ubiquity throughout Roshar, with everything from Wind Spren and Fire Spren to Fear Spren and Glory Spren appearing throughout the book. Brandon Sanderson himself acknowledged that this could be a significant hurdle in adapting The Way of Kings.
To do, as you say, the bigger issue we have discussed when some people have been pitching on Stormlight live action is the Spren. How many Spren do you put into a scene? Those are pretty expensive as these things go effects, and how much are we going to use, and how do you adapt that? And how do you not make the Spren look like Looney Tunes with someone getting hit on the head and stars spinning around their head, right?
From a technical perspective, I don't know that the Spren would be that much of a challenge, as they don't usually interact with their environment and could therefore be achieved using basic particle effects overlaid on shots. And the same goes for Stormlight and some of the other magical abilities seen in the book. Still, I'm no VFX wizard, so I'd leave that to the experts to figure out. There are also the high storms, massive, world-shaking weather events that can tear down buildings and throw boulders. Now, for the most part, except for one very notable instance, you don't actually see the high storms full on, with characters sensibly indoors while they're occurring, making them more of an implied threat. But for these, you would likely need VFX as well, or at least a lot of storm footage. But what about the mind-bending action scenes that I mentioned in my last video? The character of Szeth, who is a truthless Shin assassin, has many awesome powers, including the ability to alter the direction and strength of the pull of gravity for himself and others. Now, I hear you asking, how would you make that believable in live action? Checkmate. But the thing is, we've actually already seen action scenes like this in movies like Inception and X-Men Days of Future Past, and the same effect has been used in TV shows and music videos. All you need is one of these cool rotating hallways. Of course, for some of Szeth's fight scenes, you would also need to definitely augment them with some wire work, but overall I think it would be very doable and awesome to watch. In particular, I think seeing Szeth's first fight scene in the Royal Palace realized on screen would have viewers absolutely locked in and ready to commit to the series. Now, what about casting? I considered not including this section in the video, as I think fan casts are generally some of the most obnoxious things on the internet. Casting is a very delicate craft, and I would generally favor casting talented unknowns rather than drawing from the same minuscule pool of extremely famous and in-demand celebrities. That said, here is my definitive fan cast for The Way of Kings. Timothée Chalamet as Kaladin, Anya Taylor-Joy as Shallan, Zendaya as Princess Jasna Kholin, Florence Pugh as Syl, Tom Holland as Adolin, Jack Black as Sadeas, Ryan Reynolds as Wit, Kevin Hart as Lopan, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson as Dalinar. Okay, but in all seriousness though, I wanted to touch on this topic just because it has been brought up by Brandon Sanderson himself, as Henry Cavill apparently tentatively asked if he could play Kaladin.
I do feel bad when Henry Cavill called me and he's like, I'm too old for Kaladin, aren't I? And I'm like, yes, and he's also Asian. And he's like, yeah. He was like, could I be in the Stormlight archive? I'm like, well, I'm sure we could find something, but he really kind of wanted to be Kaladin, but he had read the books and knew that it just wouldn't work. But it was kind of heartbreaking when he called me. He's like, man, I can't be Kaladin, can I? I'm like, no, I don't think you can be Kaladin. No. But it's okay, because then he went and got the Warhammer 40K thing, and is doing that.
Now, I agree that I can't see Henry Cavill as Kaladin, fine actor though he is. I think he could maybe pull off Dalinar, although, as Brandon Sanderson mentioned, the Alethi people most closely resemble Asian people in our world, so he doesn't necessarily have the right look. Another person that's been put forward as Dalinar is Dave Bautista, which, while he isn't exactly who I pictured when I read the book, I think he could maybe pull off a version of the Blackthorn, as I do think Bautista is a very underrated dramatic actor, and could capture the warrior-turned-philosopher that is Dalinar, while bringing some prestige to the series like Sean Bean did with Game of Thrones. But yeah, what do you all think? Who would you cast in a Stormlight Archives adaptation, and what production hacks could you think of to make it feasible? Let me know in the comments. Peace out.